Hey everyone, thanks for joining. This is our second, but first of our new series of Arrow's user office hours or webinars. So thanks everyone for joining this morning. I'll do a quick intro here and then I'll hand it off to Sherelle. But my name's Kim. I help with ops and a little bit of marketing here at Arrow's. So we're going to be doing a bunch of different office hours and webinars over the next month or so, and hopefully we'll continue. Hopefully it's valuable for you, and definitely let us know how you're feeling about it. But this first one is going to be talking about dynamic branching, which is a feature inside Arrows. There's a lot you can do with it, and it's actually really easy to set up, but it feels a little bit complex to some people. So we wanted to do kind of a deep dive, show everyone how it works, different use cases, and kind of how the setup works for it. So if you have any questions at any time or thoughts on dynamic branching, how you're using it, definitely want this to be interactive. So definitely throw that in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. But for now, I'll hand it off to Sherelle, who, if you're an Arrows customer, you probably know. He's our head of customer success, works with all of our customers at Arrows, and he'll be doing kind of a demo and showing everyone how dynamic branching works.
Thanks, Kim. Hey, everyone. Good to virtually see you. So I'm really excited to talk about dynamic branching because it's one of the things that, and I'll also preface with this is available on our pro tiers and above in the Arrows world. But what it allows you to basically do is remove a lot of the manual components of customizing plans for every customer. So you can have one kind of master template with a bunch of different tasks and phases in there, and then dynamically choose to include or exclude them based on conditions that you have in HubSpot. So that sounds very complex and fancy, but really it's just including and excluding certain tasks, certain phases, certain parts of forms. It just makes the whole thing a little bit more dynamic. And what that allows you to then do is have that main starting point, but also more quickly make a plan look and feel like what it should to that customer. The most common example, and I'll go through the process of setting one up, showing how it looks on a template, showing what it looks and feels like. But the most common example I often see is, let's say you are a company that sells 5 products, and I get to pick and choose which of those 5 I want. And so whether it's a form that you're indicating in the plan itself, which of those products you have, or if it's already pre-recorded in HubSpot and a property on that deal or ticket that your plan is tied to, that information then allows you to set it up in a way where if I only bought 3 of those products, I would only see the respective tasks and phases for those 3 products. Whereas if I did 5, I would see all 5. And it's all in real time. So if you change the property in HubSpot, or if you change the form in Arrows, all of that updates again in real time, which ultimately means your teams and you as onboarding reps don't have to do a bunch of manual work every time. So let's look at an example here. I'm looking at a very basic template setup that I have. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Kim, for screaming that. Here I have 3 phases, and I'll touch on what these little bits mean here. So I'm going to start with dynamic branching at the phase level. You can do this for every individual task as well. I won't get into it at the task level here, but I'll show you at the phase level. Just know it applies in both worlds. So here I have an example of a product where there are 3 different types of data integration available. We have user data, we have email data, and we have payroll data. But not every customer might get that. And then on the HubSpot side, if I jump to this record in HubSpot, I have a property for, we call it integrations required. And it's just a drop-down or a multi-select of these 3 data types. And ultimately what this is going to do is communicate to the plan based on the answers here, which of these phases should be shown or not shown. So these I already have set up, but I'll show you the full setup in this world. So if you turn on this little branch button, you'll see the option to toggle it on. And this part's where it gets a little bit confusing. Ultimately, it's the same thing. It just depends on how you structure your properties in HubSpot and how you want to then either include or exclude by default. Most commonly, I personally use this top version, and I see most customers use this version, where by default, what we're saying is this thing is not a part of the plan, and include it when one of these specific conditions gets met. So in my case, I'm using a ticket record for onboarding in this example. So I'm going to pick a ticket condition here, and I'm going with by default, I want this phase excluded and only show it when a customer has that user data toggle on. So I'm going to add a ticket condition here. You'll notice a drop down appears with all of your respective ticket properties. and I'm going to search for that integrations required property that we had set up on the HubSpot side. And you can see we'll auto detect that property and give you a few different operators. In my case, I'm going to go with includes because there is a version where you could have 1, 2, 3, or a combination of those things. So I usually end up setting it up with includes. If it's a very specific thing like a single line text or a multi-line text, equals probably makes sense, but includes usually will cover most of your bases. So then I'm going to say for this example, I only want this phase to be a part of this customer's plan if user data is one of the selected options or is included in the selected options. You can add a bunch of and or logic here. You can also make it so that it only happens one time or happens multiple times. This is similar to if you're familiar with HubSpot's workflows, the re-enrollment feature that they have there. So by default, we allow it to be dynamic. If for some reason you only want it to happen one time, you can also toggle that on. But in this case, I'm going to keep it pretty basic, make sure that it's for user data, as includes. I have the integration required property that I care about here, and I'm going to save that condition.
Sherelle, I'm going to stop you really quick because Chad asked a quick question. I know you like to cover this one. Chad asked why you would not use equals instead of includes in the dynamic branch.
Yeah, great question. So the way it's part of this is the way HubSpot formats properties, and they come over in a string of text when you're doing a multi-select property. So in the code base, what that would look like would be user data, semicolon, email data, semicolon, payroll data. So when it is that long string of text, the includes operator makes sure to pick up those bits versus equals would, in this example, be impossible if I wanted to do a combination of them because there's no world where it would ever just equal that if I selected 2 of those because of that line of text. So the rule of thumb I have is like if it's a drop down or multi-select option, I usually go with includes. If it's like a radio select or single option, then you can get away with equals. So hopefully that helps, but feel free to ask more. I was asking in reference to a drop down specifically. Drop down, I think also comes over as, well, drop down, I believe you can only do one option. So if that's the case, then yeah, you can pick includes or equals, sorry. But great question. So once I have that set up, you can see here now, I'm still in edit mode on a template, and it now lets me know that there are branches that are excluded. If I were to jump into view mode, in the internal view, I can see everything. I believe in the editing world on the participant view, I'll still see everything until we have a plan. Then you'll notice that these will go away. So I'll show you that in a second. The other thing I want to touch on is how does this information get updated? So you could come in here and update these on the record, and in turn, when you create the plan, all of that would transfer to the arrows plan and recognize the conditions and show or hide. In my example, I also have a form set up in arrows where you or the customer could answer that. And then actually behind the scenes, that form is also talking directly to that property. So this is the form action. And if I go to edit here, you can see I picked the same field type for ticket property and that same integrations required property. So what this is now doing in theory would be if I answer this question, it would update this property in HubSpot directly. And then in turn, those other phases would reference that property and show or hide those respective phases. Dynamic branching also works in forms itself. So I actually have a secondary form here as an example. Oops. Let me finish setting that up and then I'll touch on that. So as another layer of dynamic branching, I can say here that if the answer to this form actually is user data, I want to show a secondary field in this form and also require people to answer that. I'll touch on this a bit more once I create the plan. But basically, in forms, you also have the option to dynamic branching. And in this case, I'm referencing the answer to this form above here and saying when it contains user data, show me this field itself. So that if I jump into view mode here, you can see here right now that secondary field isn't available. But if I click user data, it would show me that secondary field because I said when the answer contains user data, I want to know exactly how many users. Whereas if I did email or payroll in this example, that secondary field wouldn't show up. So that's a little bit of how to set up this thing. Now I have these 3 dynamic branches. I have a form that would potentially talk to that property and in turn show this. And let's jump into a plan and see what it looks like for the customer. So here I have this property is empty. So by design, none of this should show up when I create this plan. So I'm going to go into this create plan flow. I'm going to pick that template that I was just looking at, and I'm going to hit create plan. I'm going to also jump into full views because it's a little easier to see. So now you can see when I'm looking at this from an internal or external perspective, those phases are not a thing. So when you are including or excluding stuff, it's as if they don't exist. You'll see in the progress bar, it only shows 1 of 3 tasks. It is not part of the reporting. It's not part of the data. It's not something the customer would see. It truly is included or excluded until those conditions get met. Now, I'm going to go in here and actually answer this in the full flow because this will update that property and in turn show me those respective phases. So if I hit payroll data here, I can hit submit. Now, if I jump to HubSpot and refresh this, we should see that this property for integrations required is updated with payroll data. And if I jump back to my plan overview, you'll now notice that the payroll data phase has appeared in here directly. So in that flow, whether it's me answering that, whether you're asking the customer to self-select products, or if you've already collected that on your sales deal and then passed it over to your onboarding ticket, you saw that this all happens in real time. Now the progress bar shows that secondary phase. It shows that there are tasks in here. If I had another layer of tasks in here that I wanted to also dynamically branch based on the type of payroll data, for example, I could go into that logic and start setting things up that way. But basically what I can do now is have a property where someone can self-select this information. And even though I already had answered payroll once, because I have that sync on to allow it to happen again and again and again, now resubmitting that data would show me all 3 of those phases because now all 3 of those conditions are met on the HubSpot side. So I see this often used for this example of like products purchased versus products available. I also see it, like we use it in our own plans for things like we have a task at the top here that says access your Arrows account or create your Arrows account. And depending on a property in HubSpot that I think is powered by Stripe or some other system that tells it this account does or doesn't exist, we then can choose which of those tasks you see. But then it allows me in my day job to not have to open every single plan, understand who that customer is at that level, and try to make sure that their plan is fully aligned. I can just rely on the automations behind the scenes to do most of that for me. I love it too because it obviously makes the customer experience a little bit smoother. They only see stuff that's pertinent to them. It makes it a lot easier for Arrow's admins. There's a little bit more work up front to set up that main template with some of those branches, and there's some thinking behind that goes into it. But then once it's up and running, it makes the plan creation and sharing flow so much easier because now I know all of this stuff is current and up to date. I showed you a version where I was obviously doing this after I created the plan. But if you had already set this up before, or like I said, passed it over from the sales deal, this plan would be created with all of that information that's already pertinent to the customer. So I'll pause there for a second because I know that's a lot and it's a little bit complex, but any questions, thoughts, or even use cases that come up in your world that you want to chat through?
Chad said, would you use dynamic branching to collect several users' user data? For example, you ask how many employees do they want in X system and click the first name, last name, email address, phone number, etc. Or is there a better way? Seems like a lot of HubSpot properties that would need to get created for all that data to land.
Yeah, so that's a great question because it is a little bit contingent, obviously, on having it reference a HubSpot property, at least for the branching piece of it. The form stuff you can do within the form and reference the data in the form. And I think we will eventually add the ability to reference some of this stuff based on Arrow's activity. For today, it has to be on the HubSpot side. So I probably would ask the question of how many combinations are there for the thing you're describing, Chad? And if it becomes too many properties to build, I would probably maybe do it manually or think about a different option there. You can also embed third-party forms if it's a little bit easier to collect that information like in a HubSpot form and then do what you want with it on the HubSpot side and then push it into a single property. But depending on how big of a setup it is, I kind of pick and choose the path I take for that. I also personally like doing it at a phase level for that reason. I try to make the tasks in the phase all pertinent to that phase, even though you can go task by task in here. And I've seen plans where there are hundreds of tasks with all sorts of combinations of branching in there. Those folks do set all that up on the HubSpot side. So it is possible. It just depends on how much effort or work you want to put into the HubSpot setup side.
Yeah, Chad has the use case where he would ask a question saying, how many users do you want in their tool? And then they say 5. And then basically it would like create 5, it sounds like separate kind of tasks or form fields to collect that information.
Yeah.
I think this is one that Sherelle and I kind of play with internally a lot. And it works with dynamic branching. I think it's probably not the primary use case, but it could work for that use case really well.
Yeah, I've actually seen Kim set that up in that exact way where you answer a property here that says, let's say this was 5. This 5 gets sent to a HubSpot property. And then depending on the number, you have 5 other branches below that says, if it's less than 4, show this. If it's less than 5, show this. If it's less than 3, show this. My kind of personal rule of thumb is if it's above 10, I don't want to go build that many properties and things to set it up. That specific question, though, is also a feature request we've heard often. So we're also thinking through from the engineering side, is there a better way or an easier way to streamline that piece of it? Because candidly, I haven't found any even third-party forms that do that bit really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely add other questions. I was going to highlight a few other use cases that I've seen for dynamic branching that I think works really well. One is if your tool integrates with a bunch of different tools. So let's say Arrows, for example, we only integrate with HubSpot right now, but let's say we integrated with a bunch of different CRMs. You could have a question, or your sales team is probably aware of that information during the sales process. If they're collecting that inside HubSpot, you can have a phase that specifically has tasks that are related to that integration. So if you're selecting that your CRM is HubSpot, for example, then we can include a phase and everything is tailored. The Help Center articles about how to set it up, about how to configure the integration, all of that is tailored to HubSpot specifically. Whereas I think before dynamic branching, you might have, or customers might have had like one big template with a bunch of different tasks inside of it, and they'd go manually delete different tasks if they weren't relevant for a customer. So it just adds a lot of flexibility to give them the actual relevant information. So Chad, I'll get to your question in a second, but I want to highlight one other is like if you have a professional services add-on for some customers, if they're adding that on during the sales process, you can include a phase specifically for that professional services kind of level of service that you're doing. So most customers are maybe not receiving that, but if they're paying extra for it, then they get an extra phase or even an extra few phases for depending on what they purchased during the sales process too.
Yeah, I've seen it used for like scheduling calls as well, where they where you only want certain like a 4th or 5th review call type of thing, or a team training call to be scheduled when someone purchases that add-on or purchases that additional product line. It's essentially a way to avoid having to manually come in here and do stuff at every customer for every customer. There are still certain tasks to some of Chad's questions and comments. There are still certain tasks where I will do it manually because the setup becomes so complex of having to have a bunch of properties and a bunch of logic in there. But 95% of the time, especially for some of this more what I consider basic or simple stuff, where it's just like, what are the products? What is the use case? What are the things you have or don't have? This works really, really well for that. And it speeds up things a lot more quickly when it comes to, again, sharing plans with customers and getting them in front of customers. And the teams that I work with who do have a lot of this setup, just their day-to-day is more streamlined. It's less contingent on like manual effort. There's a lot more quality control of what customers are seeing. And it lets you do a little bit better process management and process building at Arrows too, because again, you can have that main template. And templates, there are no limit to the number of templates you can have. So I encourage people to make drafts and make copies of them. So once you have that main template, you can also make copies of it and splice and dice it into smaller versions if you wanted to, and add branching in there even. But at a high level, it's a great way to avoid some manual work. It's a great way to make sure customers see stuff that only matters to them, and it's dynamic. So if they were to come in here and change bits, you saw a number of kind of integrations in here. Not only is this obviously changing the plan directly for them, but if you're also syncing this information over into Arrows or into HubSpot, you're also now controlling CRM hygiene, making sure that data is not in silos and it's actually being passed over to the CRM where everyone has access to it. And then in turn, making it a better experience for your customers.
or thoughts, or anyone who's using dynamic branching and finding it working well for a specific use case. I think I sometimes do our sales demos over here at Arrows too, and I definitely find that it's one of the features that people get most excited about. And then I think sometimes it feels a little bit intimidating to set up because there are a lot of possibilities, so it feels like overly complex. But hopefully you all are seeing that it's fairly simple. It's more so you need to kind of map out your process and understand what parts are variable for your process, for your customers. And then it's actually really simple as long as you have that data inside HubSpot to set it up and start using it inside Arrows.
If you're looking at a place to start with this, think about the one thing or the one piece of any process you've done with a customer where you've had to manually go in there and adjust it, and start with that one. Like if you know there's always going to be some sort of integration, or if you know there's always going to be some sort of data point that certain customers will see and certain won't see, and you're just tired of doing it manually, this is probably a good starting point.
Yeah, and Sherelle mentioned this, but I definitely recommend starting at the phase level too. I think it's the easiest and most clear to understand. But then once you understand that, I think the chat, especially for use cases like individual users, the form field dynamic branching is really amazing. And I think it's also cool because it really does update basically in real time. So your customers it almost feels, I hate it when people say this, but it feels like magic, where it's like, okay, I filled this out and now I have all of these tasks available for me. So it really gives them the tasks that they need to do at the time that they need to do it, as long as you have the data.
Yeah, definitely, to Kim's point, start at the phase level and start with this one. I don't know why in my brain this one just is easier to wrap my head around. It's not there and then it is there based on it. This is the inverse of that, basically. So it works the same and you might not have to change a bunch of your operators. But depending on how you have properties set up, either of these will work. But like I said, most commonly it's phase level. It is excluded by default and included when conditions are met. This is usually turned on, and it's usually a pretty basic one or two equation operator here. But like I said, you can come in here and get as complex or as robust with this as you want or need. And then once you get comfortable in that world, definitely jump into individual task level or form level branching.
Did you see Spencer's question is branching only based on HubSpot properties, or can it also work for Arrow's inputs?
Currently, it is only off of HubSpot properties. The way that it could, quote unquote, work off of Arrow's inputs is, as in this example here, technically this form is being answered in Arrows, but the form is tied to that HubSpot property. And so when this gets answered, the values get pushed into the property, and then it's essentially in real time when you do it this way. So even if I took off this email data one and re-updated this, if I go back to my view, you'll see the email phase is completely out of here. So that's the way where you would tie it basically to a Arrows input. If you're talking about like specific tasks or phases being done in Arrows, you can also, because you have access to a bunch of Arrows data points, all of these Arrows data points from the integration can also become triggers or operators. So you could say like when the last phase completed was XYZ, or when the current task name is schedule your kickoff call. Like those could all be triggers technically to then show or hide future phases as well. I said show or hide, but I want to correct myself because it is include or exclude. Show or hide is a little bit of a different feature, which we have a different office hour on for a new feature we call gates, which actually lets you show or hide progress and phases in here. But I have to specify that it's includes or excludes because it is not a visibility thing. It is more of a it really is there or isn't there kind of thing. Great question though.
Cool. Well, if there are no other questions, definitely still add them in if you have them. But if there are no other questions, we can wrap up a little bit early. I will say too, I think, again, this is one of my favorite features. If anyone has any specific dynamic branching kind of use cases or things that you're thinking of, I'll put it in the chat here, but anyone can email us at help@arrows.to and just let us know kind of what your thoughts are with dynamic branching, and we can, Sherelle or I or someone can record a video, kind of show you how it works, or how we might recommend setting things up. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out for questions about dynamic branching or any other features.
We also have a more general office hours on Thursday mornings, I believe,
Yes.
where it's less topic oriented, more just come and we'll talk about onboarding. So if you want to go deeper into your specific questions or needs or thoughts, feel free to join that one as well. I think we're going to do them every Thursday going forward for a while.
Yeah, I'll include a link to our office hours page on our website. So anyone can go there. You can see all of the ones that we have scheduled out for the next month or so. So register for any that you want. But yes, Thursday is always going to be like open-ended. We'll answer any of your questions and generally talk about improving your onboarding plans. But then every Tuesday morning, we're going to have a more feature-specific or use case-specific deep dive where Sherelle will kind of be doing a demo and we'll be talking through exactly how to use a specific feature inside Arrows. Cool. Thanks
everyone
for
your time today. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Kim, as always, for helping me set this up and rock and roll with it.
Of course.
And yeah, we're looking forward to chatting with you all again.
Cool. Bye everyone.